Alright, so we're getting into Chapter 31, Western Society in Eastern Europe in the Decades of the Cold War. There's your page number, so get to page 752 right now and spend a little bit reading that introduction. There's no notes you need to take on page 752. Just read the introduction so you see the stage is set. And I'm going to say clang clang whenever you need to pause. So clang clang. Alright, so then we look at page 752, we see the first heading. So the big red headings should be the main ones off to the side if you're doing Cornell notes, or just make them big and noticeable. And then the smaller ones, like on page 753, Europe and its colonies and the Cold War, those are other headings. So page 752, we have 1, 2 paragraphs. Maybe you can write 1 sentence. Then Europe and its colonies, 1, 2, 3 paragraphs. Maybe you can write 2 sentences. So spend a little bit of time going through writing the headings and skipping lines. Count paragraphs, and every paragraph you count, skip at least 1 line. Clang clang. Alright, so let's get into the notes here. In the beginning, what you need to know is after World War II, the Cold War starts, and that creates some tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, but it also sets the stage for the decolonization that we just studied. Europe was busy fighting the war, and Europe has to deal now with the Cold War, communism versus capitalist democracies, and also with rebuilding their own economies. So Europe and its colonies are having conflict. As you see in this little section here, the colonies have been kind of doing it themselves for 5 years while Europe was fighting the war, so they want independence. That's everything we've just seen with decolonization unit. Now the Cold War is important. We're coming back to it, and this is going to be page 753. The highlighted stuff there is stuff that for you to particularly focus on. We formed NATO in the West. The United States and Western Europe and others that are Western influence create NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Then the USSR thinks, oh, they're trying to make their own alliance, so the USSR makes its own alliance called the Warsaw Pact, and that's Eastern Europe. They take what's called a buffer zone. They take countries in between the West in Europe, so West Germany and over that way towards France and Belgium and all them, and they take the Eastern European countries and make them sort of like a zone of protection so that Europe can't invade Russia without having to go through those other countries. Germany is a big point here because it has East Germany and West Germany, and then Berlin itself has the wall built down the middle with Berlin, East Berlin, and West Berlin. We also see some what are called proxy wars. We didn't actually fight the Soviet Union, but we did fight in Korea and we fought in Vietnam to try to stop the spread of communism. So as you go through page 754 and 755, you see a lot of terms that you should make sure you get. Harry Truman, Iron Curtain, Marshall Plan. The Eastern Bloc is what I was talking about for the buffer zone. North Atlantic Treaty Organization and Warsaw Pact. That's all page 754 and 55. When we move on to page 756, look at the side. You've got the definitions and explanations for some of those terms. And we have a new topic heading, which is the resurgence of Western Europe. The biggest thing in Western Europe is that it has a lot of economic and political development. They have to rebuild their economies, and so they have a lot of activity. And then we have what you'll see there on page 756, the Marshall Plan, which is where we're giving lots of money to try to help them rebuild. And this leads to a spread of liberal democracy. There's a lot of new constitutions that are written after World War II. Nazi party in Germany is done for. The fascist party in Italy is done for. So the losing countries have to make up whole new constitutions, and that eliminates any chance of having, or not really eliminates, it helps prevent any chance of having a future fascist dictatorship like what Hitler did and what Mussolini did in Italy, which we'll see later on. But you see what I highlighted there, new constitutions, firmly established constitutional democracies. This is something you should be able to compare with Latin America. Remember, Latin America saw a lot of democracy spread and rise after 1945 and decolonization. So this is a comparison and contrast you should be able to make between Europe after the war and Latin America after the war. Then the welfare state. We did have the warm-up question on that. The welfare state remained, and in fact it kind of got strengthened as governments moved to try to take care of their citizens' needs more. And what it talks about in this particular setting, you have a couple of terms there on page 756 and 757, technocrat and welfare state. And what we see is that parties have a very vigorous debate. You have power moving back and forth. You don't have people getting overthrown like we see elsewhere. You have elections where parties take power. This is also the era where we see student protests, particularly in the United States, beginning throughout the 60s. So it's kind of an up and down. Socially and politically, people start moving to the left because they want more government involvement in the welfare state, and then towards the end they start moving back to the right because the economy is slowing down because of all the extra spending and the problems caused by the 60s. So then we get into the next page, which is 758, and that's new challenges to political stability. Again, we have campus unrest. That's the protests. You have a green movement, which is a term you should make sure you get off page 758. And there's a picture there of Dr. Martin Luther King. This is where we see the civil rights movement begin and really, not really begin, I'm sorry, really begin to have national and international attention, especially because of campus unrest. The Vietnam War also, people are protesting. We also see during the 70s there's new social movements, like with feminism and environmentalism, and that's part of the essential question that we look at is how does the post-World War II world adapt to environmental challenges? And environmentalist movements try to protect the earth. Next, we move on to page 758, the diplomatic context. You've got the European Union, which we had the question about, and I explained in class that it was so that European nations can trade a lot easier. And later on, what we see what has become today is it's more like a single government for the European continent, that they have input. Each country has input into other countries as far as what laws can be passed and things on certain areas. The currency, they have a common currency. It's not just about tariffs anymore. It's more about having a single European government. We also see that because of things like the European Union and more people cooperating economically, there's less nationalism. There was extreme nationalism in Germany with the Nazi Party, and there's less nationalism now because, and which leads to a lot of peace because of the economy. Whenever you are doing business with someone, you're less likely to fight them in a war. This leads to the next part, which is page 761, and the economic expansion. The economy gets good. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, almost 8 paragraphs where you can write maybe 4 or 5 things where you try to explain in your notes a little bit about how the economy boomed. What does affluent mean? What does consumer oriented mean? And then towards the end, it starts to slow, where there's still advancement, but it's just not as much of an explosion. There's an in-depth and thinking critically that we're not going to worry about there. You can do those on your own. Read about United States and Western Europe. You don't have to write any notes on it, but there are some guidance questions that go along with the thinking historically reading in depth. Then we get into page 762, Cold War allies. We are sort of taking the lead after World War II. Britain is having to rebuild itself. They're expanding their welfare state and not focusing on the military side of things as much. We were largely untouched because of World War II, because none of the fighting took place really on our borders. So we are like the foreign policy leaders. Since Britain is losing its colonies, Britain is losing its empire is shrinking. And so we incorporate Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Those are dominions that used to be part of, in this case, Britain. And so they become a part of the larger world because they're not under the thumb of Britain as much. We also see a lot of immigration here. This is something that's important for migration. We see Asian immigration into Australia because of economic strength. So then we move into the U.S. century because we talk about how the United States is the dominant power in the world after Britain shrinks. So we enter into what the book calls the U.S. century. We are kind of the leader of democracies and capitalism, and the Soviet Union is the superpower that's the leader of communist nations. This sets up our Cold War conflict. And this, what we see there, the Truman Doctrine. Make sure that that's something that you look up. It doesn't have it on page 763 or 64, bold. So make sure you look up what the Truman Doctrine was, because we're trying to stop the spread of communism. So look into that on your own, do a little research. And we, as we saw previously with Latin America chapter, we're intervening in Latin America. We see some local or internal conflict with domestic protests because of Vietnam, which leads to us getting out of Vietnam. That goes back to the Asia chapter. Remember, decolonization is something that is a major event. So now we're seeing, well, why did decolonization happen? Why did all these things occur? Part of it is the Vietnamese wanted the French out in the 50s, so we got involved in the 60s, and then our internal conflict led to us getting out in the 70s. By the 90s, however, we are the winner. America, we won the Cold War. We are the only superpower left after that. Now, there's other economic strength superpowers, but as far as being military, economic, ideology, being the dominant figure in the world, we're the last one. And as it points out, as the century begins to close, the Middle East becomes more of a focus, not Latin America, Asia, Africa, like we just saw with decolonization. Now the focus starts to shift into the Middle East again. So then we move on to page 764 to culture and society in the West. Consumerism becomes like the big ism that defines Western society. Make sure you know what consumerism means. You might want to look it up and give yourself a definition for it. Social structure, if we're talking about the Persia chart, social mobility means if you're poor, in Western countries, you're able to work your way up so that you can become from lower class to middle class to even upper class if you work long enough and hard enough. Middle class jobs provide more pay and better benefits, and so therefore people are able to take more time off, so there's more leisure opportunities. We see because of immigration, there's more unskilled labor that doesn't require degrees or advanced training that's being done by immigrants. And there's also an increase in crime. This is all social stuff. Then we get into the women's revolution. This is pretty major, especially for the AP key concepts. We see women becoming more and more a part of Western society after World War II. Married women who are working in the West increases. Women have the right to vote more and more throughout the West, but also throughout the rest of the world. Divorce and birth control provide women with opportunities to decide what sort of family life they want. They're getting married later. Daycare centers actually begin to have more of a, it would have been unheard of before for a woman to leave her child at a daycare center because she would have been at home, and now she's working, so she has daycare centers. There's new feminist waves throughout the 60s and 70s. And basically what we're going to see with the Industrial Revolution later is undone. The Industrial Revolution is kind of gone at this point, and we see more of a social revolution. Then Western culture. As we move along, you've got page 766, New Feminism, and then Western culture, page 767, where the United States is kind of the center of the world. New York is more important than Paris. We have the technological developments. There are still some technology around the world, but we have a lot of it, especially throughout the 60s when we're trying to beat the space race of the Soviet Union. Then we have popular culture, that is, we're exporting around the world. People are wanting to be more like America, learning more about America. The cultural influence, while we might not have colonies that we're politically in charge of, we do have a lot of cultural influence. And then that leads us into the cultural conflict in page 770 of the Soviet Empire and the Cold War. Soviet Union wanted to be independent of the rest of the world to show that communism works, so they emerge as a superpower that has nuclear weapons, and they're like our rival globally. And as they're creating their new empire, they use Eastern Europe as the buffer. I've already mentioned it. That's the clearest example of their power. They sponsored elections and decided who could run and who couldn't run. They limited freedom of press and speech, things like that. They control education, and they promote propaganda. The Berlin Wall, they literally built a wall to keep ideas from the West, like democracy, capitalism, freedom. They built a wall to keep it out of the East. And then they put down any rebellions like we see in East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. With Poland, make sure you pay attention. On page 771, there is an important term there that you should make sure you know for Poland, page 771. And then the evolution of domestic policies, even though they're still Stalinist, which means they do things the way Stalin did them, they're restricting things, and this is controlling society a lot more. And you see party membership is restricted. So rapid industrialization creates some problems and opportunities in Eastern Europe. Make sure you read this. How about this? Read this and try to summarize it. Cling clang. Okay, so page 773, 74, 75. There's not really any important terms to write down, but what you do need to know is the change in culture. What sort of social problems are they faced? What sort of economic problems do they face? And then the political problems. Then economy and society. They're kind of behind the West. They don't really have the TVs and the entertainment, leisure stuff, because they're working on industry. They're just trying to keep their economy running. And as a result, they're heavily polluting. They don't really care about the environment when they need to build factories to catch up in production. But there are some similarities, and these parallels are something that you should make sure that you pay attention to with Western culture. Clang clang. All right, so then de-Stalinization. After Stalin died, there was a new successor, and they didn't really make a whole lot of changes, but they just kind of talked trash about Stalin after his death. And the USSR was ahead of us in the space race till we landed on the moon in 1969. And their growth is up and down, which eventually led to their downfall because they just couldn't economically keep up with us. So overall, this whole chapter is about the West and the Soviet competition. Now, I'll say cling clang on this because these are some important supplement questions that you might want to focus on and be able to answer. So cling clang. Now, this timeline is something you might want to put into your notes. You don't have to memorize these, but this should help you be able to put stuff in order. I thought this might be helpful for you this time around to know the dates that we're talking about. Clang clang. All right, so in between the questions that you should be able to answer and the timeline, that should do your notes for you. So good luck. Write. You're going to have a quiz on Wednesday, and I'm checking notes on Wednesday. Hope you have a nice week.